It's a great pleasure to be here. I think this is an amazing program. I'm very happy and excited to be here. So really, thank you. And I'm going to try to explain what this concept of active efficient coding is, which we've developed over the last couple of years in collaboration with the lab of Bert Shi. He's a professor at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Before I get started, just a few words on about our institute, because we're still fairly young. We are celebrating our 10th anniversary this year with this think tank in Frankfurt for theoretical sciences, doing research in physics, chemistry, biology, neuroscience, and computer science, with the overarching theme being self-organization and structure formation in complex systems. I think some of you have also been visiting the Ernst Strüngmann fora that we have at our institute building here in Frankfurt. So it's a fun place to check out, and of course we are always happy to have visitors. Now, in the context of this workshop here, I think I couldn't think of any better slide than to put this picture of Claude Shannon here to introduce the talk, whose invention of information theory has not only revolutionized many fields of engineering, but also had a gigantic impact on the neurosciences, where what I'm particularly interested in. And very shortly after Shannon's invention of information theory, the impact could be felt in the neurosciences in publications by Etnev, Barlow, and others over the years. And this has, in a way, led to the formulation of what we now call the efficient coding hypothesis, which basically says that biological sensory systems exploit redundancies in the sensory signals to encode information from the environment more efficiently. So, and what I'm going to be talking about is less about curiosity and information seeking as a goal for an intrinsic motivation, but as have this efficient coding as a goal for an intrinsic motivation. And that's sort of a subtle distinction, maybe. Now, this has been with us for many, many years, and a modern formulation of these efficient coding ideas are so-called sparse coding algorithms, which have been developed since the early mid-90s, very famously by Olshausen and Field. They came up with this sparse coding algorithm that learned from patches of natural images, okay, and tries to learn an efficient representation for them, where we could go into details as to what exactly that means, and I have one little slide on that. And then some magic happens. It's looking at lots of these patches of natural images, and then it learns some representation, as is illustrated here, as time goes on. And the representation that it learns, indicated by all these little patches here, these little basis functions, have many properties in common with the receptive fields of neurons in primary visual cortex. And that was sort of considered a big achievement, that now we can understand what these cells in visual cortex may be doing from this normative viewpoint of, hey, the system is just trying to encode the statistical structure of natural images particularly well. And that's why we see these Gabor-like receptive fields in primary visual cortex. And that's sort of considered a big milestone in computational neuroscience. And of course there are sort of many modern versions of this, and since then a lot has been happening. Just a little sort of excursion here into sparse coding for those people who are not familiar with this. One of the sort of basic ideas is that if you have a particular image and you want to encode a little patch of this image, you're going to describe it as a superposition of these basis functions phi. And this would be a dictionary of these basis functions. So every kind of patch here we want to represent as a linear combination of these basis functions. Okay? So if I want to represent this particular one, then maybe I'll start with a basis function that already has some of this sort of vertical structure here. And that may be sort of a very crude approximation of what's going on in this patch. But if maybe I add a little bit of this one, and a little bit of this one, and a little bit of this one with just the right weights, then maybe this sum here ends up looking very similar to the original patch. And what is sort of the hallmark of these sparse coding algorithms is that, well, there's sparsity. What does sparsity means? Sparsity means that for any of these patches here, we are only allowed to use a small number of these basis functions to represent it. And there's this notion of over-completeness, which means that we have a big dictionary to choose from that has many more basis functions than we have pixels in an individual patch here. Okay? And a generic objective function would be to basically make this approximation very good, but then also somehow incorporate this sparseness constraint that we don't want to use too many basis functions. And one of the arguments you could put forward for that is just energy efficiency, right? Being very active for neurons is metabolically quite expensive, right? The brain uses up 20% of your metabolism anyhow, so you want to be very careful with these resources. Now, so this has developed into a really big field, and people do lots of things these days, right? They quantitatively compare the learned basis functions to biological receptive fields. They study the influence of the eye optics on the statistics of the signals that need to be encoded. They look at so-called non-classical receptive field effects, complex cells, what goes on in higher cortical areas, other sensory modalities, how you can do all that with spiking neurons. It's become a gigantic field. But all of this field has really been working under this basic assumption here that there are these statistics and we want to encode them. And what we are arguing now that it's about high time to extend this traditional view in a very fundamental fashion. And that's where the active comes in effect in active efficient coding, which is that you need to consider the role of behavior and how it actually influences the statistics of the sensory signals. And of course, right, it's sort of very easy, and it has been noted very early on and many times that depending on how you behave, you change the statistics of what you see, right? If you imagine a small California ground squirrel running at high speed with the eyes just centimeters above the ground, right, the optic flow fields that it will see and send to its brain will be quite different from a tall primate sluggishly walking through the woods or something like that. And depending on where you pay attention, what you choose to look at, you're also changing the statistics. Now, so it's clear that, right, the way you behave changes the statistics of the signals. But what we are now looking at is really this other link here, and how we actually generate eye movements based on the kind of representation that we've already learned. So the question is, in fact, is it possible to utilize behavior for efficient coding? Can we adapt our behavior to make this system here that tries to encode what's out there work as efficiently as possible? That's what we call active efficient coding. So we've been studying this with a whole number of people for quite a few years. This really started about 5 years ago when I started collaborating with Triesch and his lab. And a bunch of people in my lab have been very much involved in this work. Konstantin Rotkopf, was a postdoc, is now a professor in Darmstadt. Céline Teulière was a postdoc in my lab, is now a professor here in France in Clermont-Ferrand. Luca Lonini was a PhD student. He's now in Chicago doing a postdoc. These people are still present in the lab, and then also, importantly, 2 visitors. One of them, Sébastien, is actually here in the audience and who has also made an important contribution in this whole endeavor. So, but how does it actually work? So, what is it we're doing? The basic idea is summarized in this slide, and it's extremely simple. It's kind of embarrassingly simple in a way. So we have sense organs that provide input, and that goes into an efficient coding model, right? That does your sort of sparse coding, as tons of people have done it for many, many years. But now this representation that is being learned here serves as the input to a reinforcement learner that will generate eye movements. Okay. Now the question is, what does this reinforcement learner receive as a reinforcement signal? What is the little R, the reward signal? And here the idea is that the reinforcement signal is generated by the efficient coding model, and it tells the reinforcement learner how well the sensory coding model manages, how efficiently it manages to encode the sensory input. That's the basic idea, and if you take that home, then basically I've got my message across. And this is somewhat related to ideas on intrinsic motivation and using learning progress as a reinforcement signal, but it's really compression progress that we're after, and that has also been highlighted by Schmidhuber as a sort of intrinsic motivation objective function. Yes?
The encoder only knows what's encoded. How does it know what's the sensory signal? What's the reality, right?
Well, it receives...
Maybe I'm misunderstanding it. Yeah.
So it receives the sensory input, or basically, right, the images or whatever comes from the LGN goes into visual cortex. So that's there in principle. And of course, it creates its own little representation. And it can try to match these up or see how well this sort of matches up.
So you must look at the sort of the raw data is in the LGN, and then it compares that with the
I'm sort of at this point agnostic to where exactly this happens, right? Maybe this could be between layer 4 versus layer 2, 3 or something like that, or no, it could be different cortical layers.
But you need to assume the sensor signal is somewhere. The raw data is somewhere. And then, so you can compare how efficient are...
Well, the raw data comes in here, whether, right, but
is it at the retina and LGN, layer 2, layer 3? You have to make some assumption.
No, I don't really have to. We can afford to be agnostic here about that.
You're assuming it's taking in the image data, right?
How do you
That's what you're actually
compare
feeding
the
it, right?
efficiency then?
Basically, we're normalizing the energy of the input through a normalization step, and then just look at the reconstruction error of the pre-processed whitened image. That would be sort of the LGN stage, and what the sort of latent representation of the sparse coding model is. But there are other ways of doing this, potentially. This is the first and simplest and most generic thing that you can think of in this context. You know, if this efficient coding model is a generative model, then you can look at something like a reconstruction error and use this as a proxy for coding efficiency very well. Okay, so basically coming back to this picture here about statistics, representation, eye movements, we have the efficient coding model that translates the statistics into a representation, and now we have the reinforcement learner that translates this representation into eye movements. So what is this going to do? It turns out the best sort of a nice playground to study these ideas is binocular vision. So you all know that we have two eyes and we can use them to sort of see the world three-dimensionally, and the information from both eyes is first coming together in individual neurons at the layer of the primary visual cortex. And in the primary visual cortex, you have cells that are tuned to disparities, to subtle differences in the difference in the position where a point is projected in one eye versus the other eye. Right? And there's a whole sort of little zoo of cells with different disparity tuning properties. And what we're going to control, of course, are the vergence eye movements, or these inwards and outwards rotations of the eye that you do right as objects approach or recede from you. Now, this is a very interesting problem in a way, and it has been studied for, I don't know, forever, for centuries essentially. But I think one of the really most fundamental and striking things about binocular vision has actually not been answered yet. And this is really how this control of vergence and the development of this disparity tuning somehow go together and make sense together. So looking at this situation here, the statistics of sensory input, what we're going to be talking about are now binocular images that we're trying to encode. And this kind of sensory representation that we may expect to form or we want to form are little basis functions tuned to different disparities. And the behavior will be these vergence eye movements. But you see how all these things interdepend, right, through this coupling with action through the environment. And in fact, there's, I would argue, a chicken and egg problem here that nobody has been really addressing in a satisfying fashion, because in order to control vergence properly, you need to know about disparity. That's obvious. But in order to learn about disparity, right, you need to have at least some coordination between the eyes. Right? If you move your eyes like the chameleon, or you're sort of suffering from bad strabism, then you're not going to learn about disparity in the normal way, and this whole sort of learning process may not unfold in the proper way, and you'll end up with a form of strabism, amblyopia, that prevents you from doing proper coordination of the eyes and binocular vision. So what I'm going to present you fixes the problem. And we have a little model that shows how this learning loop can unfold and lead to the proper behavior. And we've implemented this on this iCub robot here. And in order to do so, you have to sort of make things a little more complicated than they're here. But it's really the same basic model. So this is sort of a more sort of fanciful version of what we're seeing, but it's really the same thing. I'm not going to go into the details, but there's binocular input. It goes into a sparse coding stage. And there's a reinforcement learner. The only thing that's a little more complicated here is that the sparse coding stage has two scales, two spatial resolution scales, which we needed to introduce in order to deal with the gigantic range of disparities that you'd find that we'd have in the real iCub robot with its cameras and the parameters, where you easily have disparities of 50, 60 pixels or so. And with working with these sort of 10 by 10 or 12 by 12 image patches, you wouldn't be able to sort of register that properly anymore. So that's why we have a coarse scale sparse coding model and a fine scale sparse coding model, which is the simplest thing you can do. Of course, you can do think about something that sort of uses a continuum of scales, has some foveation even, right? Lots of ideas for future work. But this was sort of the simplest thing that just does the job beautifully. And for the learning, so the sparse coding is actually a very generic, simple matching pursuit algorithm just for computational efficiency. And for the reinforcement learning, we're using this natural actor critic learning with a softmax action selection, and you have sort of discrete commands how to change the vergence angle that we put on a logarithmic scale, so we can have very fine control but also very big vergence eye movements. And as I said, the reward that this reinforcement learner receives is just the negative reconstruction error coming from these sparse coding models, where we just sum it for the coarse scale and the fine scale. So as simple and generic as you can think of it. Good. Yes?
So here the reward is just the reconstruction error, or the reconstruction error plus a term of sparseness?
So both only work with the reconstruction error. There's no extra sparseness term in the cost function necessary here, neither for the reinforcement learner nor for the sparse coding model, because of the way this matching pursuit algorithm is constructed, which is it enforces a sparse representation by just setting a limit. After I've activated 10 basis functions, I stop. So it's sort of implicit in the algorithm. Okay, good. So, okay, now we have binocular input. So instead of learning little Gabor patches, we learn these binocular patches, which of course many people have done before, but not with this sort of simultaneous learning of the eye movements. So if you have patches here, we concatenate them into one long vector, and then we have these basis functions here that are now also that we can always plot as left patch on top of right patch, so we can sort of see whether there's sort of any tuning for disparity, and you see all sorts of things going on here. You see many of these basis functions that basically look for the same pattern in the left and right eye, so these would be tuned to zero disparity. But you also, of course, find some that are tuned to non-zero disparity, like the one up here, or you find some that are just monocular. They like to see some structure in one eye, but they are sort of pretty homogeneous in the other eye. And of course, but this is also what you can see in biology, these different kinds of tuning functions. Now, how do we test this? So the model that I've just shown, we first play with this in the iCup simulator. We let the iCup just look at these planes here on which we paste different pictures, and then the iCup has like 10 time steps time, right? 10 steps for making Virgin's eye movements, and then we replace the picture with a different one, put it at a different depth. And does that mean I have 10 minutes left, or I have
for the talk, but then 15 minutes for questions.
Okay, good, perfect. Okay, and here's just what this model does. Let's start with the pink line, where we look at the full model with both scales, and as a function of learning time, we're plotting here the average mean error of the Virgin's angle, right? So let me remind you, there's nothing in the system that explicitly tells it to engage in, to try to fixate, right? It's just that the system discovers that it's useful to do so because it helps with efficient encoding of the sensory input. And you see that this average Virgin's error, goes down until it saturates here, and it saturates at a level that is basically given by the resolution of the motor space. So basically the system is self-calibrating and self-improving, and it will keep getting more and more accurate until it hits its physical limitations, given either by image resolution, motor resolution, or sort of cognitive resources available in the sparse coding model. Right? You can imagine if that is very poor, then that will also limit the accuracy. Now let's compare this with a model that only has this coarse scale, right? It only gets sort of very blurry view of the world. Well, this will also learn just fine, but it cannot become very accurate because the visual resolution is missing to discriminate small disparities, small sort of shifts between left and right eye, which is very natural. But you also see that without this coarse scale, the system will actually not learn anything and basically end up making chameleon-like random Virgin's eye movements and never basically find a way to improve its coding efficiency. Okay, so, and one of the things that really got me excited about all this is that we can train this model in the iCup simulator and then without any change, just try it out on the real robot with these sort of learned filters and the learned policy from the simulator, and it just works. I mean, it doesn't work super accurately, but it does something very sensible. What you're seeing here are the views in the fine scale and the coarse scale of the central part of the image. That's what the system is focusing on. And here we plot an anaglyph of the left and right image, also the central part. So meaning the grayscale left image and the grayscale right image are superimposed as red and green channel into one image here. And what you should see is no double images, right? So the robot manages to align the two eyes properly. Here's sort of a slow motion of that, where you see initially there's the double image as the object at a new depth, and then it makes a couple of vergence eye movements and brings these two images on top of one another. Because, right, that makes intuitive sense. What the system has discovered is if I fixate and look with both eyes at the same point, then left and right image become highly redundant. So I can encode them much more easily, and it learns to exploit that. Okay, so this is nice. What we're currently doing, and I'm only going to say one word about this, we are sort of extending this now from the robot to a sort of a fanciful simulation of what's going on in binocular development of human infants. So we've created this model that we call Open Eye Sim that actually has a simulation of the ocular eye muscles. We have 6 of them for each eye. And this is work by Alex Priamikov in my lab, which we'll hope to use in future years to basically address what's really going on in different forms of strabism and amblyopia. So we sort of have a lot more realism here on the motor control side of things. And I just want to show you that, yes, you can now pull on these muscles and it verges, right? So this is just great. So this is done with a software platform called OpenSim, developed in Stanford for all these biomechanics simulations. Comes with tons of muscle models, and let me just stop this here.
Does it do torsion?
Yes, of course. That's one of the main reasons why we went for this. So we also have these oblique muscles and can do torsional eye movements. Okay, so good. So I told you about active efficient coding, and I showed you that yes, we can sort of in an autonomous and self-calibrating fashion learn binocular vision. But this is actually more general. So if you think of motion perception and smooth pursuit eye movements, we can in fact use exactly the same model with just a tiny modification to also account for much of that. So the idea being, again, right, if I follow an object with my eyes, then temporally successive images become again highly redundant, and the system discovers that it can exploit that to increase its own coding efficiency. And here's what this model looks like. It's sort of turned by 90 degrees, but it's really the same thing. There's sort of the images coming from the cameras. There are these sparse coding models, fine scale, coarse scale. There's a reinforcement learner that now learns to make pan and tilt movements of a camera based on what this guy has learned, rather than vergence eye movements. And this paper just got accepted 2 days ago, I think. And here's just a little video showing how that works. Again, we train first with the iCup simulator. Here you see the iCup looking at these objects that are moving in front of its face. You see the eyes move here a little bit. And what we plot here is what the image in the eyes looks like. Again, it's this kind of anaglyph where t and t+1 are superimposed. And here you see, it's a little unclear, crosses and blue crosses and red or green circles, I believe, that are the actual velocity and the desired velocity that typically line up pretty well. And here's now just a little test showing that this is also producing intelligent behavior on the iCup robot. The caveat with these kinds of demos always being you never quite know to what extent the person holding the book is following the eyes of the robot or the other way around. But I trust Celine that she did this properly. And here's just another example, right? And that's not self-evident that you can train this in a simulator and then it works fine on the robot.
Okay, so sorry, so the way this works is you define the target and then you say how efficiently am I coding that target. You reward it for maximizing the efficiency.
It's trying to encode the entire central image region, and it's trying to do so as efficiently as possible. That's all that is needed.
You say this is the image.
Yes.
This is the image, right?
Yes.
It cannot decide that that's the something else is there.
No. There's no sort of attentional mechanism that would tell it, okay, now I want to look over there, and right. So this is more about whatever you decide to look at, I want to encode it as efficiently as possible. So I would see this as sort of a separate mechanism. But it might still be interesting to think about, relationships and parallels. So good. So if we sort of step back and look at this sort of basic idea and see how plausible is this as a sort of model for what might be going on in the brain actually during infant development, as during the first 3-4 months infants learn these kinds of eye movements. Well, I think that the brain might be using efficient coding strategies. Many people would agree on, right? That's sort of fairly accepted. That the brain uses concepts of reinforcement learning, right? We all heard a lot about reward prediction errors and dopamine. So I think that's sort of also pretty safe ground here. The big innovation and the central prediction of all this is that we're postulating here a reinforcement signal rewarding coding efficiency in the sensory cortex. This is sort of the testable, hopefully testable prediction of this whole approach. Now, why do I think this may actually be true? There's a whole literature in psychology on perceptual fluency that sensory inputs that are easy to process are associated with positive affect. So you might be likely to infer some reward signals being associated with the phenomena described in this literature also being present. And if we sort of have moments where we find a solution, where things fall into place, where we can encode things much more efficiently, that this is associated with reward signals, I also find a very plausible idea. Okay, so far so good. Now I want to I could stop here, but
as you wish, we have still 15 minutes, which you...
Well, I'll just tell you one speculative thing here about a possible connection to imitation learning, and that should only take a minute. Many of you know songbirds who learn a song by imitating the father's song, like in these zebra finches. So there's a sensory phase where they learn what the father's song sounds like, and then there's a partly overlapping sensory motor phase where they start twittering happily and over time adjust their song to sound very similar to the father's song. Now, what does this have to do with our active efficient coding? Well, the idea is the following. If you're the juvenile zebra finch and you've learned what the adult song is supposed to sound like, and now you're generating songs yourself for the first time, okay? If you generate a song that is very dissimilar from what the father song template is that you've learned to encode properly, well, then this is very hard for your auditory system to encode. Okay? If you, however, produce something that is sounds very similar to what you're used to from your father, well, that will be very easy to encode for your auditory system. So the sort of basic idea is, if we postulate a reward signal for efficient coding, then this similar sounding song would be associated with a positive reward, and this would be associated with a less positive or negative reward. So what we're arguing here or what I've argued, is that actions imitating the parents' vocalizations will produce sounds that are easier to encode and may lead to sort of positive reward, which will facilitate the imitation of the father's song in that case. Well, that's
the child's song could be easier to encode, no? I would see this more like, if I understand the experiment, the idea is that, okay, as you hear the adult song, if you tune your features or you tune your encoders, and then that's why you already have the encoding tuned to that thing, because the child could be easier, could be simpler to encode. Right?
For the child to encode its own song. Well, this...
Because it's already tuned to the other one, even if it's more difficult. Why is the adult song easier to encode?
Well, because the auditory system has been tuned to this kind of input. It's a very, very basic idea. Okay, good. So let me sort of wrap this up. So what we've been developing here is what we call active efficient coding. So ACT to improve the coding efficiency of the sensory data. So far we've been looking at this for vergence and smooth pursuit eye movements, but of course you can also think about this in other sensory systems, not just vision and not just movements of the eye, of the sense organs potentially, but could involve pretty much anything. We've seen that this leads to an autonomous development of binocular vision and motion perception that's fully self-calibrating and robust. Right? These models need no model of what the plant looks like, you know, how the eyes are, what distance, and how to actuate the motors. No model necessary. It's all just driven by efficient coding. And there may be this sort of speculative connection to imitation. And with that, I'd just like to thank you and acknowledge my funding sources.
So, did you also, do you think that there's also a role of this reinforcement learning in the learning of molecular receptive fields and eye movements that are not fusion eye movements? So do you think they are also controlled by reinforcement learning?
Possibly, yes. So there's, we're talking to Michele Rucci, who's studying fixational eye movements, right? Microsaccades and fixational eye movements. There may be an interesting connection there, but I don't really want to say much about it, but it's something that we are sort of interested in.
Did you simulate it? Does it really buy you something in terms of learning speed?
In this monocular case? No, we haven't done anything yet in that respect.
Yeah, thanks. It was really interesting. Your general framework of increasing coding efficiency, of course, leads to a strive for maximum familiarity, doesn't it? You showed this quite clearly in imitation and so on. So how does this relate to novelty seeking then?
Well, as I said, I would say this is probably a somewhat different system that wants to seek out novelty. And novelty per se, or right, maximizing the amount of new information may not always be a good thing, as we've sort of already learned about, right? There may just be more information that we can process. There may be no learnable structure in the information. So maybe there's a bit of a sort of ecology of different kinds of intrinsic motivations. Learning progress I like a lot as an idea, but efficient coding may just be another one that's also quite important. Yes.
Okay, so let me ask a bit. Maybe this is philosophical, but I want to push you a little bit on this. So the calibrator in your in your simulations, you use the natural image. You take the natural image and its statistics. And I mean, we have to consider the brain doesn't know the natural image. It doesn't know what are the pixels. It only has its own internal representations. And then I understand, okay, So let me just push this. I mean, what the brain actually knows is when it acts on something, did it get the desired result? So really the feedback there, I think ultimately will have to involve how successful is your visual representation to get you what you want. So you do have to incorporate the action, right? I mean, it's a whole different, what do you think about that? I mean, could you extend this to real active vision where you select what you want to look at and you
I mean, let me just, I agree, right?
Yeah.
The question is, what is it that you want, right? And there are many things that we want, right? We want to avoid predators, right? And find mates and food and... Yes. But arguably, we may also want to save energy, right? And make sure that we're not wasting our neural resources, which are very precious, right? Also metabolically, as I said. And so really the system needs to do justice to a range of objectives and trying to, I don't know whether it's sort of the wisest approach to try to put everything into sort of one big cost function and right, say that everything needs to be derived from our ability to create offspring. I mean there's sort of let me say it another way. Using efficient coding is generically useful no matter what you want to do and whether you want to use your visual system to find food, to avoid predators, or who knows what, right? I think that's what I'm trying to argue here.
I can to build on that. So my question was related to when you do efficient coding, it seems real because you're building a representation that is able to generate again the same pattern you saw, and it's maybe not useful for your survival because while reconstructing something is useful to extract features. But maybe actually with what you saw, it's kind of the idea of exaptation. Maybe we want to, this system of trying to reconstruct something leads to some interesting behavior such as emergence and pursuit, which is later useful to have a higher level behaviors or recognition, or which is later useful to have these survivors.
I think you're making a very good point there. You know, the reconstruction is sort of a simple proxy. It's nothing more. I don't think there's any deep insight into trying to, or any use in reconstructing. We want the brain, I think the brain wants to build good models of what is out there. And these models should also be efficient and not waste resources. I think that's what's really going on. And a very simple and generic proxy for do I have a good model is, can it actually encode the stuff? So, nothing more.
In your model of movement following, actually, if you have a small object that is moving, I guess that if you code for efficiency in coding of your information, if you move your eye, there will be more differences between your two images than if you just don't move your eye. So how does your model deal with it?
That's a very good observation, yes. So if you had a tiny object in front of a big static background, then the most efficient way to encode the whole thing would not to follow the object, but to keep our eyes at rest. So we just made the object sufficiently big here. Okay. What I think is really necessary is an extension of these ideas to focusing attention on a little small object and sort of getting rid of the rest of that. And we actually have some ideas for how the control of attention, just to use the metaphor of a simple attentional spotlight, could be also couched in these same efficient coding ideas, where instead of making eye movements, you're making sort of internal cognitive movements of controlling an attentional spotlight that could lead to the same thing. The basic idea being essentially that if you try to encode everything, right? You're faced with ever new constellations of foreground objects and changing backgrounds, right? That's a big mess. That's very hard to encode. But if you manage to focus your attention and always have that person and sort of basically dampen the background behind it, you get something that's much easier to encode for your sort of higher level processing stages. And if, right, so what we are arguing is that the same ideas of efficient coding could also drive the development of attentional control processes in terms of foreground background segmentation. We haven't investigated that, but sort of we at least wrote a grant proposal on that so far.
So maybe a last quick question, and at the same time, maybe Triesch, you can.
So, if I understand well, if what matters in the end is how much energy you're consuming, then so shouldn't that matter how fast you reach efficient coding, and then learning progress seems to be the thing that matters. So the time it takes to plug it in.
So in these situations, there's not really the problem of choosing what I want to learn now. Because, I mean, in the versions example, right, there's just a scene, you can make versions and you try to learn that as quickly as you can. It's not that we have this gigantic motor space to explore, like in your learning to produce language or something, where it's very important to focus learning on one thing or another, on that thing where we can't really make progress. I think the situation doesn't arise here simply because we're usually learning just one thing, right? Versions or smooth pursuit movements, but there's not this problem of where am I making the most progress now? Do I want to focus my learning on this versus that? Because we're essentially only learning one thing here. Maybe I didn't quite understand, but then we'll have to try in the break.
Thanks again, Jochen.
Thank you.